Go ahead and get started. Just a few things. This will be, today will be the final, of course, lecture, Friday. Just to say I've really enjoyed presenting the course and gotten some very nice feedback from many of you, so thank you for that. And just to say that if you need to contact me or wish to contact me, I can, or if you need to find out, or if you want to tell somebody how to find the details on my book or whatever, if they just Google my name, Compton and Human Origins, or if you want my contact details, Compton, UCT, you can find me pretty easily, I hope, on the internet. And you can find the details about the book, or someone can find those there. And just a reminder as well that, as I mentioned yesterday, the Botanical Society bookshop at Crescent now has restock of the book, and it's generally available at booksellers within here and other parts of the country. And I am working on getting it into exclusives and bargain books, but that's going to take a little bit longer. So if you, in other words, if you find yourself with a burning question that my book isn't able to answer, you can pop me an email or a response form on my website, and I'll try to come back to you with an answer.
Sorry?
Yeah?
I'm setting a book is upstairs.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, both Clark's and Bay Books are selling it here. But just to say that beyond summer school, they will, of course, continue to sell it at their bookshops, but there are other outlets as well that sell it. Okay, I had a few questions. The one I had at the end yesterday was about the explaining the oxygen isotopes, which I haven't done. I will have a slide here where I'll mention the oxygen isotopes and what they are briefly. And then, meanwhile, there was a question, do we know the reason for the cycles of climate change in the past? Which is a very good question. It's a very involved answer. I could probably give a summer school course on past climate change alone. So I won't have time to really explain it, except to say that just as with CO2 increasing with human burning of fossil fuels, in the past, the atmospheric CO2 and methane concentrations also varied naturally, largely in response to changes in the amount of solar radiation received from the sun, and also from amplification of the Earth's system in terms of the exchange of CO2 and other gases with the ocean and the biosphere. So as you can imagine, that system is quite complex. It involves the entire biosphere, it involves the ocean and the way the ocean circulates, and so forth. So unfortunately, in this course, we won't have time to explore why those variations occur. I do explain them a bit more in the book, not in great detail, but I do give a bit more information in terms of what is thought to drive these glacial interglacial cycles. Okay. And then there was another question. While the Sahara was a desert, why did they not migrate north along the green Nile Valley? Okay, that's a good question. The river was there. The problem with the river was it's really in the desert. Okay, so you've got this flow of water, and there's really nothing beyond it. Is the problem. So you would have water, but you'd be hard-pressed to get much food, is, I suppose, the best explanation for that, in that the river cuts through a very dry part of the desert, and although you could follow the river course and have water, the question would be, what would you eat? And there would certainly be some life forms associated with the river, but perhaps one would argue not enough, perhaps, to sustain migration. Okay, so just a quick recap for yesterday. The focus was on how we acquired culture. And I gave you a brief overview of the evidence. Much of it has only been revealed over the last 5-10 years, particularly from the work by archaeologists in the caves of South Africa, where they've uncovered really a very rich record that's been well dated, because this material is occurring within caves in layers. And the layers can be dated, and they can pretty precisely tell what was happening when. And so the upshot of yesterday was that when our species formed, it always had this large, very clever brain, but perhaps only when pressed to do so was it fully utilized in the sense of innovative culture. And I think most of us can relate to that personally, right? Using your brain is actually pretty hard work. It's not something we normally choose to do. We usually use our brains when we're worried about something, we're trying to figure something out, we're trying to wrap our head around understanding something. It can be a struggle, and it can take quite a while for us to finally understand something or to figure out how to make something work or fix something or whatever. So our ancestors were probably no different. And the suggestion that I made yesterday was that many of these innovative cultural artifacts were probably in response to real needs, the mother of all invention, right? If there's a need to figure out how to capture more food from the landscape, people will figure that out, or they will certainly try. We then said the second part of yesterday's lecture was about how once these modern hunter-gatherer type cultures, particularly things like the bow and arrow and other aspects of technological advance, these were very mobile groups that could expand throughout southern Africa, that they were prevented from moving into Eurasia until this desert barrier was relaxed, and that we had some greening, and then they very rapidly spread throughout the world as a consequence. And this is a plot showing you, I showed this to you briefly, and this raises the point about the oxygen isotopes. So in this plot, you can see oxygen isotope values plotted here. And basically what this is showing you is that the oxygen isotopes, at the time that modern hunter-gatherers emerged, moved out of Africa and occupied Eurasia, you had a lot of variation within that isotopic value. Now in this plot, this is the oxygen isotopic value of the ice itself from Greenland. So what they've done is they've gone to Greenland. Greenland, as I mentioned, is the one place in the northern hemisphere where these large ice sheets, it's the only bit remaining. They drilled 3 kilometers thick through that ice sheet, and then they layer by layer analyzed it in terms of its chemistry. And one of the things you can measure is the oxygen isotopic composition of the water. So water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen, and you can measure what the oxygen isotopic composition is. Now, what is an isotope? An isotope are different masses of the same element. So oxygen comes in a 16, a 17, and an 18 molecular mass. So we call those the 3 isotopes of oxygen. And what this isotope value is the ratio of the heavy to the light isotope. And why is that useful? It's useful because at that mass difference between 16 and 18, they chemically behave the same atom, oxygen. But their mass difference means there's a kinetic difference in their rates of movement and reaction. So in this case, this is meant to reflect temperature variations in the Greenland system. In the case where I showed it to you for the glacial interglacial cycles, That's the oxygen isotopic composition of the bulk ocean. And what's happening there is during a glacial, the water that evaporates that eventually goes into forming the ice is isotopically lighter than the average because it's easier to evaporate oxygen that's 16 mass than it is oxygen 18. Because it's lighter, it's easier to evaporate, and it tends to preferentially get focused in the ice. So for that reason, the oxygen isotopic composition is extremely useful in determining these glacial interglacial cycles. So that's just to answer that question that was presented yesterday, and I hope that at least gives you a rough idea of what that's about. But the upshot is, look at the amount of variation in here. Now this is from Greenland, and these are very large variations in the oxygen isotope composition, implying that the temperature is shifting quite radically through time. But we notice that at the last bit of time, the most recent bit of time, which we call the Holocene epoch, extends back 11,000 years ago. We can see that although it does have some fluctuations, it's much more constant than before. And that's a really critical observation in terms of what we're going to talk about today. And that stability of the climate during the Holocene. And since we left Africa and had this big expansion, we can see that the climate has been quite variable and generally quite cold. And the idea here is that up until about 14,000 years ago, this little warming spike here, and then really from about 10,000 years ago, or the beginning of the Holocene, is when farming was initiated. And farming was, along with the control of fire, which remember had a huge impact on our lineage with Homo erectus, farming stands out as really another big, big factor in terms of certainly our cultural evolution. Because 14,000 years ago, everyone was a Stone Age hunter-gatherers. Now, there had been a lot of cultural innovations, and we saw some of those beautiful cave paintings and some of the Venus figurines and so forth in Europe during that time. But basically, everyone in the world, including the ones living in Europe and in Indonesia and in North and South America, as well as Africa, were still basically Stone Age hunter-gatherers. Okay? So culturally they varied. Some of them had innovative solutions to certain problems, but ultimately all of them were limited by the amount that the natural food could produce. And what happened in this climate transition to the stable Holocene period was we observed that that is when farming was initiated. And by the year 2000 years ago, essentially everyone was either a farmer or fed by farmers. So it was a very radical, major transformation at that time. And that introduces then the last lecture, lecture 5, Success of the Human Superorganism, Can It Last? So I will explain in more detail what I mean by human superorganism, but in the meantime, the point being that before farming, which was 10,000 years ago, they're estimated to have been about 5 million people. So after that great expansion, people filled the world. The census, of course, they didn't do censuses back then, but the estimate based on population densities that are known from various sites, estimated 5 billion, which is about the size of a major city in the world today. Say a Singapore or San Francisco or something would typically have about 5 million people. In fact, Cape Town has about 4.5, I think, the greater Cape Town area. So imagine the population of the greater Cape Town city area. That was the world population. Okay? Not a lot of people. If you think of today, where we number 7+ billion people. And the point here is that the numbers matter. The numbers matter because if you want to sustain innovative cultures, one of the key factors, at least appears to be, that you need a lot of people. The more people you have, the more likely it is you're going to have somebody who's going to be able to figure something out. And we're all intelligent, but we're all intelligent in different ways, right? So one person might be good at figuring out how to find water when water is scarce. Another person might be able to figure out how to better trap animals to get more food. But the point being that the more people you have, the more mental resources you have. And in general, cultures, of course, have to be taught. So if you have a great reduction in population, you have the potential for losing cultures. And we've all heard of the loss of, for example, language. Many languages have been lost through the loss of populations and the dying out of the last person who spoke a particular language. So what we'll also talk about in this lecture is the concept of the Anthropocene. Maybe many of you have heard of this, the human epoch. And basically what it reflects is that humans at 7 billion and at being so resource intensive have fundamentally changed Earth, both in terms of the atmospheric composition, in terms of the gas composition from burning of fossil fuels, and fully about a third of Earth's land surface has been modified for human use. And you don't have to drive very far on the N1 or the N2 to realize that when you look at all the farmland, all the deforested areas of different parts of the world, that we have had a major physical impact in terms of remodifying the Earth's surface. So burning of fossil fuels means that the CO2 is increasing the atmosphere, and it's set to double from the pre-industrial period from 280 parts per million to 560 by the year 2060, which isn't that far off. And as a consequence of destruction of habitat from farming and building and modification of the Earth's surface, there's been a marked increase in the extinction rate of species. Now, yesterday we talked already about how the arrival of humans in virgin lands like North America and South America resulted in many of the megafauna, the big animals, dying off because those were targeted to be eaten. But there was a cascading effect. If you kill off all the large mammoths, there are certain beetles and certain fungi that only grow on mammoth dung. So they all go extinct, and so on. So there's a cascade effect, and a lot of other species end up going extinct as well. But since that period of initial extinctions, these have, of course, carried on as humans have continued to alter the surface. So we're going to also talk a bit about this Anthropocene, this human epoch, and where are we going to? What lies ahead for us in terms of the future? And that refers back to this, can it last? Okay, what do I mean by human superorganism? It's not a term that's used too much, so let me try to explain what I mean by it. There, by analogy, I make it with what are called the eusocial insects. These would include ants, bees, wasps, termites. And this is an example of an ant nest of the leafcutter ants. And what it consists of is a very large chamber in which the ants, here are some of them here, they're called obviously leafcutter ants because they cut up leaves and they transport them to this nest. And they allow the decay of the leaves with their saliva on it grows a fungus, which they eat. So this, I like this example because it already shows that we were not the first farmers, right? The leafcutter ant has been farming fungus for a lot longer than we have been farming corn, say. And they have these dump chambers and a whole series of circuits through here and they have a whole complex division of labor in terms of the ants that collect the leaves, the ones that tend them in the gardens, the fungus gardens, the ones that protect the nest, and so forth. So there's a large amount of division of labor. So, and all the eusocial insects have these characteristics. They live in large territorial colonies. have large specialized divisions of labor, and they live in groups of overlapping generations, and they cooperatively raise offspring, even offspring in many cases, like for us, that aren't our own. So by analogy, we can say, well, large territorial colonies, that sounds like a country to me. We all identify usually with the citizenship, country that we belong to. Highly specialized divisions of labor, certainly that's true of our society. We all live in a society that's based on extremely specialized divisions of labor. We live in overlapping generations, in groups, and we cooperatively raise offspring, even those that aren't our own. Okay? So all of these characteristics would apply to humans. Now, we're obviously not insects, but I would argue that in our capacity to have this collection of properties as within human societies, we have been far more effective than we would have been as individuals, right? And the more these individuals and their specialized divisions of labor are organized and orchestrated, the more effective they can become, such that if a government decides that they want to land a man on the moon, which sounds like a pretty outlandish concept, they can put together all the specialized people and have them work towards that specific goal, and within a space of a decade can actually do it. So that is the power of the human superorganism, is that under that sort of government willpower to devote the money and resources towards a specific objective, they can achieve something like putting a man on the moon or the Manhattan Project, building an atomic bomb. There are a lot of examples where, as humans, we've been able to combine our cooperative resources and produce pretty phenomenal results. And part of the concept of the human superorganism is that we have these cones of interaction. So there's you, and you have your immediate group that you interact with, immediate family and friends, and then you have an extended group that would include your work colleagues and neighbors and so forth, and then you have a much larger group that you're aware of through virtual contact or knowledge. And then also, each of us exists within a whole host of series of hosted hierarchies to which we gain our identity, right? So some people you'd identify with your geographical region of origin, both in terms of the region you live in, the nation you live in, the state or province, the city, town, suburb, your actual house, so forth, where you work and what sort of company it is and what sort of unions you belong to and so forth. So this is also a very powerful aspect of being within the human superorganism, is you have all these different layers and they're all interactive and can be cumulative and very effective. And what's interesting with natural selection is mostly it's thought of as working at the level of the individual. How reproductively successful is an individual? That's a lot of what Charles Darwin dealt with. But what's become clear is that you can also have selection working on the level of a group. So how successful is a group at being reproductively successful? And I think that's a key aspect for humans. Now, I argued, I think it was in lecture 2, that the control of fire and this initial campfire nest was really the heart of the beginning of this human superorganism, in the sense that it's when we developed our highly cooperative behavioral social structures. So as far back as Homo erectus, our ancestors would have gathered around a communal fire. There was probably male-female long-term bonding over the raising of children, which was probably participated in by the group. It takes a village to raise a child sort of notion. And this made us a highly cooperative species. And that has resulted in our being very effective at basically at living and being a very successful species. It leaves us with what I refer to as the human condition, or how I define that human condition as this dichotomy that we're all faced with between acting on your own personal interests and those of the groups to which you belong. So many of us have a spouse, and we have to negotiate with our spouse about what we want and what we want to do and so forth. And we have that with our families, and then we have that with our communities, and we have that with our nations and so forth. So there is this sense that each of us has to balance this acting on our own best interest and those of the group. And our species has a very strong development of altruistic behaviors, and that we can handle large groups of strangers in a relatively easy way. So at the time of the Great Expansion, when we had filled up the world, groups of hunter-gatherers were necessarily small and mobile. They had to be to survive, because of their life through hunting and gathering. In that way, they had a big impact, as we saw, primarily through the use of fire and hunting. They already had big impacts on the extinction of large animals. But we could suggest that the world would most probably have remained one with circa 5 million hunter-gatherers indefinitely, because that was what the natural world could sustain. Okay? So if your only option was to go out and find naturally produced foods, whether it's a fruiting tree, seeds of grass, or collecting seafood at the shore, there was only so much that that food could naturally support. And that's probably where the world would have remained, except for the fact that we started to farm. And so how we ended up where we are now with 7 billion plus people can be attributed largely to two major events in our Holocene heritage. And that was, the first one was farming, which was since the beginning of the Holocene, about 10,000 years ago. And farming essentially was the domestication and the artificial or human, so human people started to select for plants and animals in an effort to increase their food production. And of course, the more food you produce, the more people you can feed, and population densities were increased. And this allowed for the development of what we call civilizations. And civilizations, with people living in large cities or large towns or groups of people, in turn set up in a way, a sense of self-domestication. Okay? So if we go back to that campfire, if you had someone who was antisocial, pretty aggro, they're not going to fit comfortably in a group around that campfire, just as they're going to have trouble in a group of people within a village. So there was a tendency for people to become a bit domesticated themselves in order to handle the lives that we have among all these strangers that we don't even know who they are, but we see them on the bus, or we drive with them on the freeway, or we walk with them wherever we go. So that was the big one in terms of forming the farming and civilizations. And then from 300 years ago, we have the Industrial Revolution, and then followed soon after with the Green Revolution. And what these were critical in doing was the Industrial Revolution tapped this huge energy reserve from fossil fuels. So primarily, initially, coal. So what is coal? Coal is just the dead remains of plants. And plants, back in the Carboniferous, say, 300 million years ago, trapped sunlight, growing as a plant. And that energy of that sunlight, trapped by that leaf, ends up in the ground, gets buried, transformed into coal. that energy of that sunlight trapped 300 million years ago is then released when we burn it in the presence of oxygen to form heat that's used to run the Industrial Revolution. And then the Green Revolution refers to, in a way, it's an intensification of farming through selective breeding, fertilizers, irrigation, to basically allow for larger and larger populations to exist by continually increasing our ability to grow more food. So here are some examples that you'd all may be familiar with in terms of domestication. The first is maize, which is amazing because it started out as this thing, hard little woody pods on this plant called, I'm not even sure you pronounce that, tonsant, from South America. And that was very skillfully crossbred to produce the initial very tiny ears of corn, and of course has since been genetically modified to form these beautiful, perfect big ears of corn. And maize today is the #1 food crop, 1 billion tons every year. And it's absolutely critical to our food production globally. But that's what it started out as. And trust me, you would struggle to get any nutrients out of that thing chewing on those woody little seeds. But we transformed it into this big ear of lovely sweet corn full of sugars. And then, of course, a good example of this human selection is our breed of dogs. Here's the Great Dane next to a Chihuahua. And they are both descendant from the gray wolf, but their extreme variation in character and traits was generated by people selectively breeding them that way. And Darwin used that a lot in his Origin of the Species book, along with the fancy pigeon breeders, in the amazing types of pigeons they could select for. So that was at the hand of humans. So hands of humans could arrive at this, and they could devise these sorts of breeds of dogs. And we're all familiar with the many different kinds of breeds of dogs, but they're all the same species. Now, whether those two could interbreed or not would be a challenge, but they are technically the same species, and if they could figure it out, they could have viable offspring. Now, remember I said that people left Africa. Here's the Sinai Peninsula down here. Here's what we call the Fertile Crescent, this arch of wetlands and region in the Middle East between Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. It's called the Fertile Crescent because it has a lot of naturally, relatively easy plants to domesticate. Barley and wheat were really a lot easier to do than maize. And so if that's true, and that had the progenitors of modern-day peas and lentils, it really was a land of plenty. If our hunter-gatherer ancestors had arrived there already by around 50,000 years ago, the question would be, why did it take until 10,000 years ago for farming to start? Why didn't farming start much earlier? Because it was the same plants, and they must have been familiar with these, because their survival would have depended on knowing all those edible plants and animals that they could tap into. And the answer is, back to our oxygen isotope curve from Greenland, is that the climate was simply, we were in a major glacial, this is the major glacial period, and then on top of that, you can see how much more variable climate was in the past. And as I mentioned, it was only in this last 10,000 years that the world became a warmer, wetter, and most importantly, a stable world. And the thing about the fortune that we have had in terms of our civilizations and farming ever since then has been that this climate has remained, at least so far, has remained more or less within a very stable range of temperatures and conditions that are very conducive. Well, as difficult as farming is today, there's still conditions far more conducive to farming than what existed before. So if you speak to farmers, it's not easy. And there's, especially among South African farmers lately with the El Nino and so forth, it's really difficult if those rains don't come when they're supposed to, or they come too hard and too fast or too early or too late, crops can be destroyed within a matter of a couple of days. So it's difficult enough to farm now. It would have been extremely difficult in the past, primarily because it was cooler and drier during the glacial period in general, and there were these warming episodes. We call them Dansgaard-Oeschger events, and that's named after the people who first described them, scientists. And they're all numbered here in red. And the point of these is they were very brief periods of pretty good warming events in the Northern Hemisphere, but they never lasted long, and they very quickly plummeted within the space of a generation or two back into cold conditions. So the idea is that although they knew those plants were there, they undoubtedly ate those plants and those animals. Farming couldn't actually take hold, couldn't actually be a successful way of growing food until this climate had stabilized during the Holocene. And to add support to that argument of a climate change being responsible is that when that climate change occurred, farming wasn't just initiated in the Fertile Crescent, which is located here, but it also took off in a bunch of different parts of the world independently. So in West Africa and East Africa, within the India subcontinent, Asia, China, Indonesia, Andes here, Central America, and within the Amazon basin. So the evidence is, now they didn't all exactly start farming at that time, but what's becoming clear is that most of these major centers of early farming were established sometime between about 11 and 9 to 8,000 years ago. And of course, each place had its particular type of plants and animals that were particularly conducive to domestication. So potatoes and maize came from North and South America, Central America. Manioc came from Brazil and so forth. So that's the idea. And of course, once these centers of farming started, what would happen is you'd, of course, have a big increase in population because more and more people were fed, and therefore more and more people could be supported. So what happened is farmers dispersed. They dispersed throughout the world in a number of different ways. I just give you two examples here. The one is referred to as the Austronesian expansion. It was out of Taiwan about 3,000 years ago, and it was possible through people building these double outrigger canoes. They could carry their pigs, their chickens, their yams, and their dogs and their rats. And they could travel over these very large distances to Hawaii, to Fuji, Easter Island, and so forth. And unfortunately, in the process, killed off many of the large flightless birds that lived on those islands, the moa being the classic example. That was up to 3.7 meters high and weighed in at 230 kilograms. So that would have been a lovely turkey dinner for people who had arrived on that. And they were easy to kill because they couldn't fly. They were big. They probably, again, didn't know who humans were, what they were about, and that they would consider eating them. And so they were easy prey, and they essentially got wiped out. The other example is the Bantu expansion, which came out of Cameroon, Nigeria, about 2,000-3,000 years ago. And the Bantu were farmers, and they spread south and east, eventually reaching South Africa by about 2,000 years ago. And they were both farmers who settled in East South Africa, and then pastoralists who settled in the West. And of course, the San, who had been here for a long time, were displaced, right? So in the case of all of these, now in this case, there were no people living out here at that time. There were Aborigines in Australia, but Australia, in the end, was a very difficult place to farm. But in Africa, of course, where people had been from the very beginning, you had the San in southern Africa, and they were displaced, of course, by the Bantu farmers and pastoralists. And that was the case all over the world. And that's why today we have so few surviving small populations of hunter-gatherers who've managed to eke out a living, mostly in areas that are simply totally not conducive to farming or to pastoralism. Now, an interesting concept, too, is that those early stages of farming may have had global impacts. And to show that to you, I've plotted here, this is the CO2 content in the atmosphere in parts per million for the last 10,000 years. And this is the methane concentration in the atmosphere for the last 10,000 years. And the way that we know what those gas compositions of the atmosphere were back that far, we know it even a lot farther, is from little gas bubbles trapped in the ice. So when they drill that ice in Greenland, or they can drill it in Antarctica, 3 or 4 kilometers thick pile of ice, they can analyze for the, in the bubbles that are trapped in the ice, they can analyze them for the CO2 and methane and compare them to the concentrations today. And what you observe is that from about 8,000 years ago, the CO2 starts to increase to levels of about 280, which was the level before the Industrial Revolution. As I mentioned, the Industrial Revolution and burning of fossil fuels is going to double that up to the ceiling up here. Methane also shows this increase since the advent of particularly rice cultivation in Asia, which generates a lot of methane as a product of the way that that's farmed with all the water. So some people have argued that we should actually be going into our next glacial. We should be leaving our current interglacial, be going into the next glacial. Maybe we're not, or haven't been, because farming produced a lot of methane from rice. And then, of course, this increase in CO2 would largely be reflective of slash and burn. All right? So, for example, when the Bantu came down, they had iron tools and use of fire. It was largely by slash and burn, the classic technique of transforming forested land into pastoral land or agricultural land. And when you burn a lot of forests and replace them with pastures for sheep or whatever, you produce a lot of CO2. And so that's the idea. And it's possible then that farming, in all of its other effects, may have also delayed or offset the initiation of our going into our next glacial period. It's a bit controversial, but I think it's an interesting concept. So in support of this idea that culture needs numbers of people, we can look at where the earliest inventions of writing took place, and those were Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and in Central America with the Mayan carvings and so forth. So the idea is that all of those people being fed meant that you had a lot of potential for cultural innovation. And one of the major cultural innovations was the written word. And obviously, I don't have time to go through all the civilizations, but suffice it to say that since farming, we can see from the history of the world that we have had this continual rise and fall of civilizations ever since, right? And what's interesting about the civilizations is they've always existed, but they never individually last that long. So they come and go. So there's the Parthenon of ancient Greece, there's the Colosseum of ancient Rome, and there's the Great Wall of China. And so throughout that time period, different cultures flourished and then faded away and so forth, and that's the whole history of subject of history, which I won't go into. But the point I want to make here is that prior to the Industrial Revolution, the world definitely had more people than the 5 million hunter-gatherers, okay? And how many is hard to say exactly, but here's 8,000, 6,4, 2,000 years ago. Say 2,000 years ago, so about the time of the Roman Empire, you probably had on the order of a couple 100 million people. That's a lot more than 5 million, but it's a long shot from where we are now at 7 billion. So even if the world had remained as it had, at this time you had all these great civilizations, but still the life expectancy wasn't much greater than prior to farming. A lot of people who did farming throughout this history, they weren't that much more effective than the first farmers in terms of the amount of food they could produce. So yes, there were these amazing monuments, amazing history of civilizations, but at the end of the day, the world was still mostly full of struggling farmers, struggling to produce the 5 or 6 bushels for every bushel they planted of wheat or whatever that they had been doing for millennia. So what transformed the world from that standpoint was the Industrial Revolution. And it's from the Industrial Revolution that we see this absolutely frightening, exponential taking off of populations of the world. So how do we understand the Industrial Revolution? And that was just the last 200-300 years. Well, ironically, we start by understanding what's called the British Agricultural Revolution. The Industrial Revolution originated, we talked about the origination of species, we can also talk about the origination of the Industrial Revolution. It was in Britain. Why was it in Britain? Because the precursor to it was the British Agricultural Revolution. What was that based on? That was based on a whole series of innovative farming innovations that greatly increased the productivity of crops. And one of those was the realization that fertilizers could replenish soil nutrition and you could get much greater yield. Where did that come from? Well, Alexander von Humboldt, the Prussian explorer, went to Peru, and the Peruvian Indians mined guano off of the offshore islands to apply to their crops to increase productivity. So the Europeans learned it from the Peruvians. And this is a picture of Jutton Island, which is off of Longabond and Saldanha Bay. And of course it's white because the birds colonize there and they poop on it all day long, and they poop over it for hundreds or thousands of years, and you get up to 50 meters of concentrated dried bird poop called guano. And this stuff was like white gold to the Europeans and other farmers, because if you crushed it up and applied it to your fields, full of phosphorus and nitrates, incredible productivity. And coming back now, that was Peru there, so there were some potatoes from there too, and maize. So all those discoveries of the New World, supposedly gone in search of silver and gold, but by far the biggest impacts that the European exploration discovered was bird poop and how it could be used to make a lot more food, and maize and potatoes. Had huge impacts, as you probably are aware of, in terms of European history. So if you have far more efficient farmers producing a lot more food than they could before, which was what the British Agricultural Revolution was about, you had a lot more people. And a lot more people started to innovate, and you needed a lot more energy. And so one of the energies was coal. And coal had been used in Britain for a long time and was used more and more. And one of the problems with mining coal was that you had to dewater the mines, which they used by horses until they developed the steam engine to pump it out. And that didn't take long to become the first steam engine for transport and trains. And then, of course, you had the whole Industrial Revolution of burning coal. And this is Leeds, England in 1896. And you can see similar images for modern-day China today from burning of coal in industrialization. And so the key here was that the Industrial Revolution led to the tapping of this incredible amount of energy that was stored in coal, and then later oil and gas. And that allowed for the production of a lot more material than was possible before, including particularly iron and steel. So again, most of you are familiar since the Industrial Revolution, everything that's happened. So I'm just going to summarize it briefly here with things like the atomic bomb, which we've had a wonderful series of lectures this week from David Wolf, for those who attended that, about the making of the atomic bomb. And that, as I mentioned, underscores the power of the human superorganism, that in the space of 4, 5, 6 years, the government could orchestrate the highly division form of labors into reaching this endpoint of this horrific, but the capacity to make those changes. Now we have, and then this sort of evolution of computers from World War II era to, this is what I typed my PhD thesis on in 1985, an IBM XT, first personal computer on the market, or one of the first, and now, of course, everyone has one of these things. And so you can see, in similar way to stone tools, we've gone to smaller and smaller size with greater and greater versatility, right? That's what we want, mobility and versatility. We've got the worldwide net and computers and so forth. So we could argue, and then, of course, we've put a man on the moon and everything else, and we could argue that we live in the best of times. But this was a famous photo taken during one of the Apollo missions by a geologist of the Earthrise. And it really did raise people's awareness of the fact of, look how small we are. And we're so beautifully marbled with blue ocean and continents and clouds. And look at the moon. Who would want to live there, right? And yet, so the contrast and that deep, cold, dark, empty space, the contrast was so powerful. So it's become this iconic image of can it last? So ever since Malthus, who was in England at the time of the population boom, he was really worried because he figured there's no way they can keep this up. It's just not possible. So some people, and he predicted a collapse based on an inability to grow enough food. Now we've so far overcome those challenges, and we've always been able to grow enough food, but our consumption keeps going up and up. And there is some ultimate carrying capacity of the Earth as a system. And one of the worries is you can go into what in biology is called overshoot, where you are overutilizing the natural system. And that's when you're into overshoot, when you're using more than the system can produce on a regular basis, a sustainable basis. And if you keep overshoot long enough, you can degrade the carrying capacity and result in a crash. So that's the worry. And so some people argue we're already in this overshoot and we're just waiting for this crash to happen. And others argue that, no, we're very clever and we'll always figure out a solution. So one thing that many people worry about is too many people. These are global populations. I showed you this plot earlier. This is the one projected into the future. The prediction is that global population is supposed to stabilize at around 9 to 12 billion by the year 2100. Whether it will or won't, I guess we'll see. But that's the prediction. So can the world support 9 or 12 billion of us indefinitely? Don't know. But what's clear from the lesson of the United States is their population since 1950 hasn't grown very much, and the little bit of growth that it has done has been through immigration, because it's essentially zero population growth as more women decide to have fewer babies later in life. But their energy consumption has carried on increasing. So they have a much more materialistic world. They consume a lot more energy. And this would be the death knell, even if we had keep population to 7 billion. If everyone else in the world, like in China, is doing, if they all want to aspire to be a USA, we're in trouble. Because then the carbon footprint of every person increases hugely, and that's going to lead to disaster. Then there's the issue of global warming. I touched upon this a little bit earlier, but basically what's been happening is with the Industrial Revolution is we've been rapidly increasing the CO2 content, shown here in blue, and the green are the CO2 emissions. And you can see there is a difference there. The CO2 in the atmosphere hasn't gone up as fast as the emissions, and that's because the Earth's system naturally is removing some of that excess CO2. But there's a question about how long the Earth can continue to do so. And then here is the global mean temperature, and you can see that it's been increasing quite rapidly in the last couple of years. So there are numerous projections for the amount of warming that depend on different climate models. It's hard to predict. Here's one of the predictions of average global temperature increases. You know, if you live in Siberia, you're probably going to be happy about this. Your winters will be a lot shorter. You'll be able to grow more food. But if you live in other parts of the world, you're going to probably be pretty unhappy. So there's the issue of global warming. And then, as I mentioned, the other big worry is extinction rates. We talked about the sixth mass extinction. If this is the long-term average rate obtained from the fossil record of the Earth, the current extinction rate appears to be about 100 times greater, and the modeled future extinction rate could be as high as 1,000 or more. And that's mainly due to the destruction of habitat from hunting and from introduction of alien species that are wreaking havoc on ecosystems. And of course, we're all familiar with global inequality. Here's the big fat USAA with the largest number of billionaires. Here's Africa, poor Africa, totally squeezed out. Europe's doing all right, but you know, it's a very unequal world, both by gender, by geography, by all these different factors, and that leads to a potentially unstable world. So that's another concern. Some people don't get enough to eat. A lot of other people get too much to eat, so we have obesity and diabetes epidemics in the world, and that's very frightening in terms of the increases in the amount of obesity and diabetes that have occurred in a relatively short period of time. I mean, since 94 to 2014, both in the US and globally, it's really frightening for those who have plenty to eat where they're headed in terms of global health. Energy, we need to be concerned about future energy. If this is China, not the whole world can't get there through burning coal, even though we have enough coal. We could get enough coal to produce enough energy, but we don't want the world to look like that, hopefully. So we could maybe try to harness little mini suns here on Earth with these plasma fusion reactors where we could every city could have its own little sun, and the sun could produce endless amounts of energy from hydrogen, which would be very nice because it doesn't produce any CO2, etc. So to end with, and what I end with in the book is sort of this idea that, you know, you can kind of imagine two scenarios, right? The awful one is the one on top, where the world becomes increasingly unequal and derisive and uncooperative and et cetera, and we end up with some sort of awful nuclear holocaust. Civilizations and humans come to an end through extinction. But the upshot of that scenario is that life on Earth would not be obliterated. Some life on Earth, particularly the bacteria, would survive, and life would carry on. We know that from the paleontological record from the history of life that I mentioned earlier, life would carry on and new things would evolve. And over time, the Earth would probably become populated again with an amazing number of different animals and organisms, just wouldn't include us. So for us, that's a bad scenario, and it would be bad for a lot of organisms, but